The silver invitation in my hands felt thick, expensive, and completely hollow. My name was nowhere on the guest list. Have you ever given every single ounce of your soul to someone, only to realize you were nothing more than their hidden shame? The smell of old linoleum and cheap floor wax always brings me back to the small apartment on Elm Street. It was a cramped, drafty place where the heaters groaned through the winter and the windows rattled every time a heavy truck rolled down the avenue. But to me, back then, it felt like a sanctuary. It was the place where I spent 24 years of my life, scrubbing, saving, and sacrificing every single ounce of my energy to ensure that my son, Rob, would never have to know the crushing weight of coming home to an empty cupboard. When my husband passed away, Robbie was just a boy with tangled hair and shoes that he outgrew faster than I could afford to replace them. I took a job working the early shift at the local textile mill, standing on my feet for 10 hours a day until my ankles swelled and my lower back throbbed with a dull, permanent ache. Every blister, every agonizingly long night, and every skipped meal was a voluntary payment toward his future. I didn't mind the threadbare coats, or the fact that I hadn't bought a new dress in over a decade. When you are a mother, your child's comfort becomes your own. I poured my entire soul into Robbie, watching with immense pride as he grew into a tall, handsome young man with a gentle smile and a college degree that I had paid for by hard-earned dollar. When Robbie finally landed his first real job at an accounting firm, I felt a profound sense of relief. My boy had made it. He was moving out of our cramped apartment and leasing a modern, sunlit place downtown. To help him get on his feet without the burden of heavy debt, I dipped deep into my remaining life savings, money I had quietly set aside for my own retirement, and handed him the thousands of dollars needed for the security deposit and the first 3 months of rent. I remember the way he hugged me that morning, his arms wrapped tightly around my neck, whispering how he would never forget what I had done for him. I believed him. A mother always wants to believe her child. Then, April Hudak entered the frame.
I still remember the first evening Robbie brought her to my little apartment for dinner. She arrived wearing a pristine cream-colored trench coat, her hair styled perfectly without a single strand out of place. Her nails were manicured into sharp, elegant points, and her perfume was heavy, expensive, and suffocating in my small dining room. From the moment she sat down, an unsettling atmosphere settled over the table. She looked at my modest floral plates with a polite, masking smile that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. Throughout the dinner, April didn't speak much to me. Instead, she spoke at me, dropping casual remarks about the neighborhood, the age of the building, and how important it was for a man like Robbie to maintain a high-end image if he wanted to succeed in life. Every time I tried to share a story about Robbie's childhood, she would smoothly steer the conversation back to their weekend plans, their upcoming trips, and the upscale lifestyle she expected. But what truly chilled my heart wasn't April's passive-aggressive demeanor. It was the immediate, baffling transformation in my own son. Robbie, who had always been outspoken and fiercely independent, seemed to shrink in her presence. He sat up straighter, nodding eagerly at every word she uttered, his eyes constantly scanning her face for approval. When I served the pot roast, a dish he had loved since he was a toddler, April cleared her throat softly and murmured something about red meat not being a part of their new organic lifestyle. Without a second thought, Robbie pushed his plate away, offering me an apologetic, strained smile. After dinner, I walked into the kitchen to prepare some tea, leaving the two of them alone in the living room. As I stood by the stove, waiting for the water to boil, the low murmur of their voices drifted through the doorway. Curious, I paused, holding my breath. "The place is exactly how you described it, Robbie," April's voice whispered, stripped entirely of its polite dinner tone. It was sharp, transactional, and dripping with condescension. "We need to make sure we don't spend too much time here. It's draining. And your mother needs to understand that your priorities have shifted now. You belong in a different circle." There was a heavy, suffocating silence. My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited for my son to defend me, to defend the home that had sheltered him, or to at least say something in my honor. Instead, Robbie's voice came out small, compliant, and unrecognizable. "I know, April. I'll handle it. She'll understand. She always does." I stood frozen by the stove, the whistling tea kettle suddenly sounding like a distant, agonizing scream. When I finally walked back into the living room carrying the tray, the whispering stopped instantly. April smiled sweetly, smoothing down her skirt, while Robbie looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. In that quiet, heavy kitchen, a seed of intuitive dread was deeply planted in my chest, and a cold realization began to wash over me. The son I had spent my entire life protecting was slowly slipping away into a shadow I couldn't reach. The front door clicked shut an hour later, leaving me alone in the sudden, echoing silence of my apartment. I sat by the window, watching the tail lights of Robbie's car disappear into the dark night, wondering how a mother's lifetime of devotion could be erased so effortlessly by a stranger's whisper. What dark promises had April made to my son that caused him to turn his back on his own blood so quickly? The change didn't happen all at once. It leaked into our lives slowly, like a hairline crack in a basement wall that quietly lets the dampness in until everything smells of rot. In the beginning, it was just little things, the kinds of details you try to brush off because you don't want to seem like an overbearing, hypersensitive mother. Robbie stopped calling me on Tuesday evenings, a small tradition we had kept alive ever since he started college. When I phoned him, the line would ring until it went to voicemail, or he would pick up, his voice hushed and hurried, whispering that he was out at a gallery opening or a bistro with April and would call me right back. He never did. By the second month of their relationship, my presence in Robbie's life had been whittled down to a strict set of boundaries, drawn entirely by April's manicured hands. If I dropped by his new apartment to bring him a batch of his favorite blueberry muffins, April would meet me at the threshold, her slender frame blocking the view of the living room. She would take the container from my hands with a tight, bloodless smile, thanking me politely before adding that they were actually rushing out to a specialized cooking class and didn't have time for a visit. I would find myself standing in the carpeted hallway, staring at the painted wood of their closed door, feeling like an uninvited solicitor in my own son's life. It wasn't long before the nature of Robbie's communication with me shifted entirely. The warm, rambling updates about his career were replaced by sharp, stressful conversations that always hovered around a single topic: money. "Ma, everything downtown is just so much more expensive than we calculated," Robbie said to me one evening over the phone. He didn't ask how my arthritis was, or if I had managed to fix the leak under my kitchen sink. His voice was frantic, laced with a strange, defensive anger that I knew wasn't entirely his own. The building association just hiked the maintenance fees, and April needs to maintain a certain standard for her clients. If I don't look successful, I won't get the high-end accounts at the firm. I'm just a few $100s short this month. Can you help me out? Just until my quarterly bonus kicks in. My heart squeezed with a mixture of worry and exhaustion. My own checking account was already dangerously low. Between the rising cost of utilities and the thousands I had already given him for his move-in costs, I was stretching every single dollar until it practically snapped. But the desperation in my boy's voice was a weapon I didn't know how to fight. I imagined him sitting in the dark, stressed and failing, and my maternal instinct overrode my common sense. "Of course, Robbie," I whispered, rubbing my aching temples. "I'll go to the bank tomorrow morning and transfer it over to your account." "Thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver," he mumbled. There was a brief pause on the line, and in the background, I could distinctly hear the low, impatient murmur of April's voice, followed by the sharp click of her tongue. Robbie cleared his throat quickly. I gotta go, Ma. April says we're going to be late for our reservations. I'll talk to you later." The line went dead before I could even say goodbye. This pattern became our new reality. Every 3 or 4 weeks, a new crisis would emerge. There was always an overdue bill, an unexpected car repair for April's vehicle, or a specialized professional seminar that Robbie absolutely had to attend to secure his future. And every single time, I was the silent foundation that bore the financial weight. I began skipping my weekly grocery trips to the butcher, relying instead on plain rice and canned broth. I turned off the radiators in the spare rooms of my apartment, wrapping myself in 3 layers of blankets to keep the heating bill down. I gave until it physically hurt, convinced that my sacrifices would eventually earn me a place back in my son's heart, or at least by a moment of his genuine gratitude. The illusion shattered on a rainy Thursday afternoon in late autumn. Robbie had dropped his car off at a local mechanic near my neighborhood for an oil change, and had asked if he could leave his laptop bag and some documents in my back porch locker for a few hours while he ran errands with April. After he dropped them off and left, The rain began to pour in torrential sheets. Fearing that the dampness from the porch would ruin his important paperwork, I went outside to bring his leather satchel into the warmth of the living room. As I lifted the heavy bag, it slipped from my damp fingers, tumbling onto the floorboards. The brass clasp popped open, and a flurry of papers scattered across the linoleum. I knelt down, my stiff knees aching, to gather the documents back into the bag. My eyes casually brushed against a thick, textured piece of cardstock that had fallen face up under the bench. It wasn't a business document or a financial spreadsheet. It was an exquisite, heavyweight envelope made of shimmering silver paper, sealed with a delicate wax stamp bearing the initials R&A. My hands began to tremble as I pulled the card from the envelope. The paper felt thick and obscenely expensive between my calloused fingers. I opened it, and the elegant, looping silver script blurred before my eyes as the words registered in my mind. You are cordially invited to celebrate the intimate union of April Hudak and Robbie Robb. The date printed at the bottom was less than 3 weeks away. It was an upscale, exclusive ceremony at a boutique vineyard estate 3 hours outside the city. My breath caught in my throat as I flipped the card over, searching for a separate note, an insert, or a handwritten line meant for me. There was nothing. I crawled across the floor, frantically flipping through the rest of the scattered papers from his bag. There was a neatly typed spreadsheet tucked into a folder labeled Final Arrangements. It was a comprehensive guest list, alphabetized and meticulous. I ran my shaking finger down the column of names, through the H's for April's extended family, through the S's for their professional colleagues, and finally down to the R's. Robbie's co-workers were there. His old college roommates were there. Even April's personal stylist was on the list. My name was nowhere to be found. I sat on the cold floor of my porch, surrounded by the expensive silver paper, as the realization washed over me like ice water. I wasn't just being marginalized, I was being actively, deliberately hidden away. The mother who had scrubbed floors, skipped meals, and emptied her savings to fund their lifestyle was deemed too unrefined, too poor, and too embarrassing to stand beside them on their day of joy. The sound of a car horn outside snapped me out of my stupor. Robbie was pulling up to the curb to collect his bag. I stood up, my chest tight with a volatile mix of grief and rising fury, trying to decide whether to confront my only son with the evidence of his betrayal or to wait and see just how far his deception would go. I slipped the silver card back into the leather satchel, smoothing down the creased corners with a trembling hand, and zipped the bag shut just as the headlights of Robbie's car swept across the living room window. My heart was pounding a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I stood by the door, holding the bag out to him the moment he stepped onto the porch, shielding my face from the bright porch light, so he wouldn't see the raw devastation in my eyes. He took the bag with a brief, distracted thank you, murmured something about April waiting in the idling car, and vanished back into the rain. He never noticed that the leather was still warm from my shaking hands. The days that followed were a blur of quiet, suffocating agony. I went to work at the mill, the repetitive clash of the machinery echoing the relentless questions turning over in my mind. Why hadn't he told me? How could a child look his mother in the eye, take her grocery money, and hide his own wedding from her? I felt like a ghost walking through my own life, invisible and forgotten. By the second week after my discovery, the physical toll of my secret budgeting began to catch up with me. The ache in my lower back had intensified into a sharp, burning pain that made it difficult to stand for more than an hour. My annual medical checkup was scheduled for that Tuesday. A routine appointment to monitor my worsening blood pressure and renew the prescriptions that kept my joints from freezing up. But when I looked at my bank ledger, the reality was stark and unforgiving. The latest emergency transfer to Robbie had left me with exactly $42 to last until the end of the month. My insurance copay alone was $50. With a heavy heart, I picked up the phone and canceled the appointment, telling the receptionist a quiet lie about a scheduling conflict. "You're skipping your doctor again, Jolene?" The voice belonged to Mark Shelton. He was standing on my back porch later that evening, holding a wooden crate filled with fresh winter squash and potatoes from his garden. Mark had been my late husband's closest friend, a steady, quiet neighbor who lived just 2 doors down. Over the years, since the house grew quiet, he had become the only person who noticed when my porch light stayed off for too long or when my footsteps grew heavier on the gravel driveway. "I'm just busy, Mark," I said, trying to offer a reassuring smile as I waved him into the kitchen. "The mill is running extra shifts before the holidays. I'll reschedule for next month." Mark set the crate down on the counter, his sharp, gray eyes scanning my pale face and the cold, unheated kitchen. He walked over to the radiator, touched the icy metal, and then turned to face me, his brow furrowed with deep concern. "The house is freezing, Jolene. You're working overtime, your blood pressure is probably through the roof, and you're living on canned broth," Mark said, his voice dropping into a low, firm register. He didn't use an angry tone. It was the steady, grounded voice of a man who cared too much to watch a friend destroy herself. "You don't have to say it. I see the bank statements in your eyes. You're emptying yourself out for that boy and his new girlfriend, aren't you?" I looked down at the linoleum, my throat tightening until it hurt to swallow. "He's my son, Mark. He's just going through a difficult transition. Downtown is expensive, and he is a grown man with a salary," Mark interrupted gently, placing a large, calloused hand on my shoulder. "Jolene, listen to me. A child who truly loves his mother will never build his own mansion using the bricks from her collapsing house. They are weaponizing your kindness against you. If you don't draw a line in the sand, they will strip you of everything you have left and leave you in the cold without a second thought." His words hung heavily in the quiet kitchen, cutting through the protective fog of my maternal denial. Deep down, in the darkest corners of my soul, I knew he was right. But the fear of losing Robbie completely kept my lips sealed. I couldn't bring myself to tell Mark about the silver invitation card. I couldn't bear to hear him voice the ultimate truth that I was too terrified to face. 2 nights later, the phone rang. It was nearly midnight, and the sudden, shrill sound in the dark bedroom made me bolt upright in bed, my heart instantly leaping into my throat. I fumbled for the receiver, my hand shaking. "Robbie, is everything okay? Are you hurt?" I gasped into the mouthpiece. "Ma." Robbie's voice came through the line, but it didn't sound like him. It was incredibly tense, low, and strained, as if he were speaking from a confined space. I could hear the distinct, rhythmic sound of heavy wind and rain outside his location. "Ma, are you awake? I need to ask you something important. It's about tomorrow afternoon." My breath hitched in my throat as the timeline from the silver invitation flashed vividly in my mind. Tomorrow was the Friday before the wedding weekend. "What is it, son?" I whispered into the dark room, holding the plastic receiver so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Are you going to be home around 2 o'clock tomorrow?" he asked, his breathing shallow and uncomfortably fast through the receiver. "April and we need to stop by. There's something we have to tell you in person. Just make sure you're there, okay?" Before I could answer, a sharp, metallic click cut him off, followed by the distant, muffled sound of a car door slamming in the background. The line went completely dead. I lay back down in the dark, staring up at the shadows shifting across the ceiling, the cold sweat freezing on my skin. The moment of truth was arriving at my doorstep, and a terrifying question echoed through the silence of my room. Were they coming to finally invite me with an apology, or were they coming to deliver the final, crushing blow to our bond? The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with agonizing precision, its steady rhythm sounding like a countdown in the quiet living room. It was exactly 20 minutes before 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon. I sat on the edge of the worn armchair, dressed in the neat blue blouse I usually saved for Sunday service. My hands were folded tightly in my lap, so cold that my fingers felt completely numb. The savory scent of a slow-cooked beef stew drifted from the kitchen, warming the air with a rich, comforting aroma. I had spent the morning preparing it, stubbornly clinging to the hope that a hot, homemade meal might somehow soften whatever sharp edge was coming our way. At exactly 1:55, the distinct purr of Robbie's sedan pulled up to the curb. My chest tightened so hard I could barely draw a breath. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt, and walked toward the front door. But before my fingers could grasp the brass knob, I heard the heavy thud of the screen door opening, followed by the sound of muffled voices right outside on the porch. I paused, my hand hovering an inch from the wood. "Just let me handle the talking, Robbie." April's voice cut through the thin paneling of the door. It was low, sharp, and dripping with an icy, clinical detachment. "We don't have time for a long, emotional breakdown. We need to be back at the vineyard for the rehearsal dinner by 5. Just tell her we're heading out of town for a private, exclusive weekend, and leave it at that." "April, she's going to ask questions," Robbie whispered back, his voice sounding hollow, defeated, and completely stripped of courage. "She knows something is up. I shouldn't have called her last night. It's her apartment's rent due date next week, and if she realizes—" "She doesn't need to realize anything right now," April snapped softly, her heels clicking impatiently against the porch floorboards. "We are keeping this intimate, just for special people. Your mother doesn't fit into the aesthetic of this wedding, Robbie, and you agreed. Now, open the door, let's say our piece, and get out of here. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The words echoed in the small entryway of my home, each syllable a jagged blade tearing through 24 years of maternal devotion. Just for special people. She doesn't fit into the aesthetic. Before the doorknob could turn from the outside, I pulled the door open myself. The sudden movement caught them entirely off guard. April stood under the porch light, draped in a luxurious emerald green wool coat, a sleek designer handbag slung over her arm. Robbie stood a half step behind her, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his eyes instantly darting away to avoid my gaze. "Mom," Robbie stammered, his face turning a sickly, pale shade of gray. You're by the door." I didn't step aside to let them in. I stood firmly in the center of the threshold, my posture straight, my face an unreadable mask of absolute frozen calm. The warmth of the stew from the kitchen drifted past me, a stark contrast to the bitter wind blowing across the porch. "I asked about the date of my son's wedding," I said. My voice didn't shake. It didn't crack. It came out in a low, quiet, steady tone that seemed to surprise even myself. I looked directly into April's calculating eyes. "When is it?" April didn't blink. She adjusted the strap of her expensive handbag, offering me a tight, mocking smile that was completely devoid of human warmth. "We got married yesterday," April said, her voice smooth, casual, and devastatingly cruel. She tilted her chin up, looking down her nose at me. "We chose to keep it entirely private. Just for special people, Jolene. I'm sure you understand. Robbie has a certain social standing to maintain now, and a large, traditional fuss just wasn't in our plans." I shifted my gaze from April to my only son. Robbie stared intently at the wooden floorboards of the porch, his jaw clenched, his shoulders hunched as if he could shrink away from my presence entirely. He didn't speak. He didn't look up to see the mother who had skipped meals so he could eat, the mother who had ruined her own spine standing at a mill machine to pay for his education, the mother who had emptied her life savings to put a roof over his head. His silence was the loudest, most agonizing betrayal of all. "Yesterday," I repeated softly. "Yes," April said, checking her gold wristwatch with an exaggerated sigh. "And we really must run. We have a lot of social obligations to tend to over the weekend. We just wanted to drop by so you wouldn't hear it from someone else." She turned on her heel, her elegant coat swirling around her ankles as she began to walk down the porch steps. Robbie paused for a fraction of a second. He lifted his eyes, looking at me with a fleeting, pathetic expression of guilt, before turning to follow his new wife down the gravel path. I didn't yell. I didn't cry out. I didn't beg for an explanation. I simply stood in the open doorway, watching as the two of them got into their modern car and drove away into the gray afternoon, leaving me behind in the absolute silence of my isolation. I closed the front door slowly, the lock clicking into place with a definitive, heavy sound. I walked back into the empty kitchen, turned off the burner under the pot of stew, and sat down at the table. The silence in the house was no longer comforting. It was a vast, echoing chamber of a truth I could no longer deny. I had poured my entire existence into a hollow vessel, and the realization of my own foolishness settled deep into my bones. They believed their cruelty had left me broken and defeated in the dark. But as the shadows lengthened across the kitchen table, the crushing weight of my grief began to harden into something entirely new, a quiet, unyielding armor of absolute clarity. The afternoon bled into evening, and the evening froze into a long, sleepless night. I sat at my kitchen table for hours, watching the amber glow of the street lamp outside cut across the dark room. The pot of beef stew sat on the stove, cold and untouched, its rich scent now smelling like an indictment of my own gullibility. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want to see the framed photographs of Robbie that lined the hallway, the gap-toothed school pictures, the high school graduation portrait, the snapshot of him holding his first paycheck. All those pieces of paper felt like relics of a boy who had ceased to exist, swallowed whole by the cold, calculated world of April Hudak. Around 9 o'clock the next morning, a soft, deliberate knock sounded on the back door. I didn't move at first, my body feeling heavy, as if my joints had been poured full of lead. The knock came again, steady and patient. When I opened the door, Mark Shelton was standing on the porch. He didn't say a word. He looked at my face, took in the dark circles under my eyes and the unnatural stillness of the house, and stepped inside. He carried a small thermos of hot coffee and a paper bag from the local bakery. He set them down on the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down across from me. "They came yesterday, didn't they?" Mark asked gently, his deep voice breaking the suffocating silence of the room. "They're married, Mark," I whispered, my voice sounding flat, empty of the grief that had consumed me the night before. "They got married 2 days ago. April told me it was a private affair. Just for special people. She told me I didn't fit their aesthetic." Mark's jaw clenched so hard a small muscle twitched in his cheek. His gray eyes flashed with a sudden, sharp anger, but he kept his voice tightly controlled for my sake. "And Robbie? What did he say?" "Nothing," I said, looking down at my calloused hands, staring at the deep lines etched into my skin from years of manual labor. He looked at the floorboards. He didn't say a single word to defend me. He just followed her down the steps and got into her car. Mark reached across the table, his large, rough hand covering mine. His grip was warm and solid, a stark contrast to the icy numbness that had settled into my bones. "Jolene, look at me," he commanded softly. I lifted my head to meet his gaze. "This is the moment where the giving has to stop. Not because you're angry, not because you want revenge, but because your soul cannot survive any more of their erosion. You have spent 24 years being a shield for that boy. It's time to let him feel the weather." His words didn't spark a sudden outburst of tears. Instead, they acted like a heavy anchor dropping into a stormy sea, instantly steadying my spirit. He was right. The devastating sting of the betrayal began to morph into a quiet, unyielding clarity. My son had made his choice. He had weighed my lifetime of devotion against April's shallow vanity and decided that I was the one who could be sacrificed. They believed that because I had always given, I would always continue to give. They mistook my maternal patience for absolute submission. For the next 3 days, I lived in total silence. I didn't call Robbie. I didn't send a text message checking if they had returned safely from their exclusive vineyard getaway. I went back to my shifts at the mill, working with a methodical, calm focus that surprised my coworkers. I ate my meals, I tended to the small fire in my grate, and I rested my aching back. Meanwhile, 3 miles downtown, the young newlyweds were completely oblivious to the shift that had occurred in my quiet apartment. To April and Robbie, my total silence wasn't a warning sign. It was proof that their strategy had worked. They truly believed they had successfully managed me, that by delivering the blow in person and leaving immediately, they had crushed any potential drama before it could disrupt their beautiful new life. They assumed I was sitting alone in the dark, weeping into my tea, waiting eagerly for the next crumb of attention my son might throw my way. Most importantly, they forgot about the calendar. As the final days of November ticked away, a heavy winter storm began to roll across the valley, bringing with it a biting, sub-zero wind that rattled my windows. On Tuesday morning, the first of the month arrived. It was the exact date the rent was due on Robbie's high-end apartment downtown. The steep, inflated payment that I had quietly covered month after month using my overtime wages and the remnants of my dwindling savings. I sat by my small radiator, wrapped in a faded wool blanket, holding my ledger in my lap. For the first time in over a year, I didn't get up to walk to the bank. I didn't log into the online transfer portal. I simply closed the black book, placed it on the side table, and picked up a book to read. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It felt light, vast, and heavy with anticipation. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the quiet was broken by the sharp, demanding ring of my telephone. I didn't rush to answer it. I let it ring 3, 4, 5 times, allowing the sound to echo through the apartment before I calmly reached out and picked up the receiver. April's name flashed brightly across the small digital screen of the handset, her arrogant entitlement vibrating through the phone lines before she even uttered a single word. "The rent is overdue. Did you transfer it?" April's voice erupted from the receiver the moment I pressed it to my ear. There was no greeting, no polite inquiry about my well-being, and certainly no mention of the wedding that had taken place just days prior. Her tone was sharp, frantic, and dripping with an arrogant, habitual entitlement. In the background, I could hear the faint, echoing acoustics of their spacious, high-end apartment, punctuated by the frantic pacing of heavy footsteps. I sat completely still in my faded armchair, holding the plastic handset with a steady, relaxed grip. The biting winter wind rattled the window panes, but inside my chest, everything was perfectly calm. "Didn't I tell you?" I replied. My voice was a low, measured whisper, stripped entirely of the warmth and maternal anxiety that had defined our interactions for over a year. "Tell me what, Jolene?" April snapped, her breathing shallow and irritated through the line. The property management office just called Robbie's cell phone. They said the automatic payment failed because the account is completely dry. We are in the middle of sorting through our wedding gifts and finalizing our honeymoon itinerary. We do not have time to handle administrative errors. Did you make the transfer to our account yesterday or not? I transferred it yesterday, I said, a slow, quiet smile spreading across my face as I stared at the peeling paint on my kitchen wall. Just for special people. The line went completely, utterly silent. The sudden absence of April's sharp breathing was so absolute that for a fraction of a second, the phone felt dead. The toxic weight of her own words, the exact, cruel phrase she had weaponized against me on my own porch, now hung in the air between us like a block of solid ice. What did you just say? April stammered, her calculated composure completely fracturing. Her voice had risen an octave, laced with a sudden, trembling panic that she couldn't mask. I said, the money is gone, April. I enunciated every single word clearly, letting the reality sink deep into her mind. My hard-earned savings, my overtime wages, the funds you used to build your luxurious aesthetic, they are staying right here with me. I am no longer funding an apartment I am not allowed to visit, or supporting a son who treats his mother like an embarrassing secret. Since I don't fit into your beautiful new world, I certainly don't fit into your monthly ledger. You can't do this, April shrieked, her clinical detachment completely vanishing into a wave of unbridled, ugly fury. Robbie's credit will be ruined. We have a lease agreement. If the landlord files for an eviction notice, it will ruin our reputation at the firm. You are his mother, Jolene. You have an obligation to support him. My only obligation was to raise a son with a spine, I said quietly. And it seems I failed at that. The rest is up to him. Before she could scream another word into the receiver, I calmly pulled the handset away from my ear and pressed the disconnect button. The sharp, mechanical click signaled the end of the conversation. I walked over to the small cradle on the counter, set the phone down, and unplugged the main telephone line directly from the wall jack. The sudden, deep silence that filled my little apartment was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 24 years. The fallout, however, was far from over. 2 hours later, as the gray winter afternoon began to dissolve into a dark, freezing night, the violent glare of car headlights cut through my living room curtains. The screech of tires on the icy gravel driveway echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. The front screen door was thrown open with a loud slam, followed by a heavy, desperate pounding on the solid wood of my front door. It wasn't the polite, impatient click of April's heels this time. It was the frantic, heavy-handed thudding of someone whose world was actively collapsing around them. I stood up from my chair, adjusted the collar of my blue blouse, and walked slowly toward the entryway. I didn't rush. I let him knock until his knuckles grew weak against the timber. When I finally turned the brass lock and pulled the door open, the bitter freezing air rushed into the hallway, carrying with it the smell of impending snow. Robbie Robb stood on my porch alone. He wasn't wearing his expensive, tailored accountant suit or the confident smile he usually wore when he came to collect my money. His hair was messy, damp from the falling sleet, and his expensive wool coat was unbuttoned, flapping wildly in the wind. In his right hand, he was gripping the handle of a massive, overstuffed leather suitcase, while 2 cardboard boxes filled with loose clothes and documents sat soaked on the wet porch floorboards behind him. His face was a mask of absolute, raw devastation, his eyes red-rimmed, his jaw trembling with a mixture of cold and pure, unadulterated panic. "Ma!" Robbie choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, childlike whimper as he looked up at me through the darkness. "Ma, please." "April." April threw me out. The storm was howling behind him, threatening to bury his belongings in snow, but as I looked at my only son standing on the threshold of the home he had discarded, I knew that the ultimate test of my strength had finally arrived. The freezing rain had begun to turn into thick, heavy flakes of snow, swirling wildly under the yellow glow of the porch light. Robbie stood there, shivering violently, his fingers completely blue as he clutched the wet handle of his suitcase. The boxes at his feet were already soaking through, the cardboard turning to mush under the weight of the sleet. He looked utterly broken, a stark contrast to the arrogant, polished man who had stood on this very porch just days ago to tell me I didn't fit his new life. "Ma, please," Robbie whimpered again, his teeth chattering so hard I could hear the click of his jaws. "She lost her mind when the property manager called. When she realized you didn't transfer the money, she blamed me. She said I lied to her about our finances. She said she didn't marry a man who couldn't even secure his own mother's loyalty. Ma, she packed my things and locked me out. I have nowhere else to go. I looked at my son. I looked at the tears freezing on his cheeks, and for the first time in 24 years, I didn't feel the immediate, agonizing urge to rush forward and shield him from his pain. I felt a profound, heavy sadness, but it was accompanied by an absolute, unshakable stillness. You do have somewhere to go, Robbie, I said, my voice cutting through the howling wind with quiet authority. You have a modern apartment downtown that you signed a lease for. You have a beautiful new wife whom you chose to stand by. And you have a salary that you earn every single week. But I can't afford that place on my own, Ma. You know how expensive it is, he yelled, his voice rising into a desperate, panicked plea. He took a step forward, trying to push his way past me into the warmth of the hallway. If I don't pay the back rent by tomorrow morning, they'll start eviction proceedings. Just let me stay in my old room for a few weeks. Just help me cover this 1 month until I can figure things out with April. Please, Ma. I'm your son. I placed my hand firmly against the doorframe, blocking his path. My posture was unyielding. The boy who lived in that room left a long time ago, Robbie, I said softly, looking directly into his desperate eyes. The man standing on my porch tonight is a husband. You are a married man who made a deliberate choice to build a life on secrecy, vanity, and the exploitation of your mother's love. You didn't want a mother on your wedding day, Robbie. You wanted an ATM. And that machine is permanently broken. Ma, how can you be so cruel? He gasped, his face twisting into an expression of sheer disbelief. I'm your only child. You're going to leave me out here in the snow. I am not being cruel, Robbie. I am finally being just, I replied, my voice steady, calm, and entirely devoid of anger. For 24 years, I kept you warm by burning my own future. I ruined my back, I emptied my savings, and I skipped my own doctor's appointments just to make sure your path was smooth. And the very moment you thought you didn't need me anymore, you hid me away like a piece of garbage. You allowed a stranger to tell you that your mother didn't fit the aesthetic of your life. Robbie opened his mouth to speak, to offer another hollow excuse, but the words seemed to dry up in his throat. For the first time, he saw the absolute lack of compromise in my eyes. He realized that the helpless, compliant mother he had taken for granted was gone. Take your boxes, Robbie, I said, looking down at his soaked belongings. There is a budget motel 2 miles down the road. It isn't upscale, and it certainly won't fit April's aesthetic, but it is warm, and it is within your budget. Tomorrow morning, you can go to your accounting firm, look at your spreadsheets, and figure out how to pay your own bills like the grown man you are. Ma, he whispered, one final, desperate plea breaking from his lips. Good night, Robbie, I said quietly. I stepped back into the hallway and slowly, deliberately, pulled the heavy wooden door shut. I turned the brass deadbolt, listening to the solid, definitive click as the lock engaged. Through the thin paneling, I heard the muffled sound of my son dropping his suitcase, followed by a long, agonizing silence. A few minutes later, the wet crunch of his footsteps faded down the gravel driveway, followed by the distant slam of his car door. I walked back into the living room and sat down in my armchair. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. The suffocating weight of 24 years of carrying someone else's burdens had completely vanished, replaced by a deep, beautiful sense of liberation. I looked out the window at the falling snow, knowing that the winter ahead would be cold. But for the first time in my life, my hearth belonged entirely to me. I had finally found my worth, and no one would ever make me an outsider in my own life again. It takes a lifetime to build a bond, but only a single moment of arrogant cruelty to shatter it completely. True love does not hide in the shadows of a shallow aesthetic, and it certainly does not demand that you destroy your own house just to keep someone else warm. When people show you that you are only transactional to them, believe them the first time. Draw your boundaries, find your dignity, and never look back. If this story reminded you of your own worth, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more real, powerful life stories. Thank you for watching, and stay strong.